As I was telling the Vice Rector, I was last here probably before your parents were born, anything between 50 and 55 years ago, and no, I wasn't a student. I was visiting here with my parents. My father was a senior journalist specializing in international affairs, and we used to visit Russia at the time of the Soviet Union in the 60s, the 70s, and I used to accompany them. And our visit to what was the Patrice Lumumba Friendship University was, I believe, in 1965 or 66. And I was happy this morning to notice the bronze bust of Patrice Lumumba outside where our car was parked. Obviously, it wasn't, the buildings were different. The atmosphere, composition of the students was as international as it is now. There was a difference because it was a different period of world history. And the university had been created not to start the revolution, but in a moment of national liberation, where national liberation struggles were underway all over Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Patrice Lumumba, as you know, was a martyr, and his martyrdom would tell you something about the international system at that time, which hasn't, in one sense, changed very much. I'm sure as students you're aware of what's going on, especially in Latin America at the moment. So the atmosphere was one in which the students were discussing the problems, the issues, the debates within the sphere and the discourse of national liberation. Now, my topic today is to do with terrorism. And I approach it not as a status quoist. I'm not a conservative. So I approach the subject firstly as a political scientist by training, but also as somebody who's been participant observer in the long decades of Sri Lanka's civil wars of different sorts in the south and the north of the country. Civil wars of secession, civil wars of revolution and counter-revolution. And I've also been a diplomat. And I've seen this story, the issues of terrorism, revolution, national liberation, from both sides. If I may just strike a personal note so that you get the context right, I'm sure you have a great many visiting speakers, visiting lecturers, many diplomats, but there would be very few, I believe, who would have been at any time indicted on the charge of terrorism. I'm one of them. But if you Google me, you would find that there is much criticism and condemnation of my role as Sri Lanka's ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva during the last stages, the last war that Sri Lanka waged against separatist terrorism. I was an elected vice president of the UN Human Rights Council and also a firm opponent of the resolution that the West sought to bring against Sri Lanka as the war concluded. On that occasion, 10 years ago, Sri Lanka headed a group of non-aligned countries and defeated that resolution 29-12. And there are those within the pro-separatist stream of the diaspora, Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora, who have not forgiven me for that, nor have many Western-based NGOs and human rights organizations. So you may ask yourself, I mean, if this guy, what happened? He was indicted for terrorism and then he was anti-terrorist, and did he undergo some Pauline conversion? Because there are those who have been on the side of change at one time, but then have recanted and become neoconservatives. I'm not one of them. The reason is this, that the kind of national liberation struggle or popular liberation struggles that were waged in the 1960s and which I grew up within was very different from the phenomenon that the world later experienced as terrorism. It was not the same thing. And I'm not saying this simply because I'm nostalgic for the 60s or the period of the Soviet Union or the national liberation struggles or the years of that time, and I want to make a kind of a firewall between them and ISIL and Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth, but essentially it was the same thing. It wasn't. It was very different. But this does not mean that the problem or the term terrorism had not entered the conversation at the time your university was founded. It was there, but it was on the fringes. It was a problem, but it was not mainstream. As students of international affairs and I believe of politics as well, you must know that the original use of the term terrorism and the original debate about terrorism, though not in today's sense of the word, took place in Russia. This was the debate about the Narodnaya Volya, Zemlya Volya, Narodnaya Volya, the populist terrorist struggle against the Tsarist autocracy. Now, by terrorism, what was meant was not in the modern sense of suicide bombers and buses being blown up. At that time, it was a question of the assassination of, Tsar in one case, but high officials of the system. The Marxist movement, originating with Plehano, which also had one of the former terrorists who were released from jail, Vera Zasulich, had already distanced themselves from that use of violence. Now that was not, as I repeat, the same sense in which the term terrorism is used today. But the word terrorism was used. And it was said, look, this is not the way to overthrow the system. This is wrong. Not because they were killing civilians, but the debate was on the use of assassination, of selective assassination. In fact, if you study that phenomenon of the Narodnaya Volya and later the SRs, the successor organization, the socialist revolutionaries, you would see that there was an attempt to avoid the casualties among innocents, including perhaps members of the nobility or royalty who happened to be children. So the question of targeting had already come up even within those who were criticized as terrorists. So therefore they were not terrorists in today's sense of the word. This is not ISIL we're talking about, this is not the LTTE. It was in fact a very scrupulous group or generation of committed young, educated young people in Russia. But this was the original use of the term terrorism. Not that they said we are terrorists, but their critics who also wanted to overthrow the system said you have to overthrow the system through mass revolutionary struggle, not by targeting and shooting people. And it was in fact called individual terrorism. The term that was used was individual terrorism. Terrorism was never used the way it is used now, terrorism. It was revolution or class struggle or proletarian struggle against individual terrorism. That is the targeting of individuals by small groups. So it was in Russia that the term originates. I must add though that there was another tendency in Russia that was not quite so scrupulous in the question of targeting. Because it was the Russian rebellious, the space of rebellion was not limited to the populist terrorists and the Marxists. There was another very Russian tradition, that of the anarchists, so Bakunin. And in the case of Mikhail Bakunin, or rather of his pupils, and you find this discussion in Russian literature as well, the morals that and ethics that were debated in these circles, there was a sense that it's okay to shake up the system and shake up conventional society by big bangs, even if they meant the killing of non-combatants, because according to them, if you're a non-participant, that doesn't mean that you're not innocent. It doesn't mean that you're innocent. It means you're guilty because you're somehow buying into the system. So, three tendencies. In Tsarist Russia, that was the origin of the discussion, the discourse, and even the term terrorism. The anarchists, some of whom, not perhaps Bakunin himself, but some of whom who didn't mind the targeting of civilians, the Narodniks who did mind it, but whose tactic was the assassination of highly placed individuals, and what became the Marxist and then the Leninist tradition, which used violence, but where the primary emphasis was on the class struggle. So this is what I want you to remember about the lineage or the genealogy of the discussion on terrorism. But in the period of the founding of this university, which I use as a kind of a peg, because it would be easier for you to get into the subject. We're talking about the 60s, mid-60s. The issue of terrorism had cropped up in a form that was somewhat different from its original, from its origins in Russia during the time that I'm talking about. It was not yet the discussion as we have it now, but it was on its way. And it was a very complicated issue. It was an issue that was so complicated that it became an issue that was debated between two famous friends who were among the most important thinkers in the shaping of the post-war Western philosophical discourse. And I refer to Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. And the debate which started with the debate on terrorism, ended with the split between these friends, these two friends. Somewhere along the line in my remarks, I will advertise my own books and come back to the issue of the Camus-Sartre debate. But that's a little later in this presentation. Now, what was the issue that came up between Sartre and Camus, and how did terrorism figure? It was all to do with what was perhaps the pioneering national liberation struggle of the post-World War II period. A struggle that had great resonance. The echoes are not really stopped. And that is Algeria. The struggle against French colonialism. Now, the issue that arose concerning Algeria is present today in the Israel-Palestinian case as well. In the Algerian struggle, there were the guerrillas in the mountains, the FLN, and the FLN was also very strong in the cities, in Algiers. And there was a famous movie, The Battle of Algiers, which was made decades later, but in which some of the original participants acted. And today, in the demonstrations concerning Algeria, there's an 83-year-old woman who was one of the original fighters in the 1962 uprising. Now, those are the two. It looks relatively simple, okay. In some countries, it's the jungles. If you don't have jungles, it's mountains. And if you're very lucky, you have mountainous jungles or mountains which also have jungles, like in Latin America. But otherwise, it's the mountains and it's the cities. What complicates the issue is that there were bomb blasts in cafes. In cafes, which meant civilians were being killed. Now, outright and simple denunciation was not an option, because the counter arguments were twofold. One argument was, and in fact you have this scene in the Battle of Algiers, where an FLN liberation fighter says, well, you bomb and kill our civilians, if you give us the same plane, we will be happy to do the same, but since we don't have the planes, we do it our way. So this is one argument. You kill our civilians, we don't have the same technology, we do it the way we can. It's retaliatory. The retaliation for state terrorism. The second argument is where Camus and Sartre, no, let me not run ahead of that. The second argument was that, look, these are not innocent people. These are French settler colonialists. So, insofar as they are settler colonialists and we are trying to get rid of them from Algeria, it's perfectly okay to blow them up while they're having dinner. Now, this resonated back in France itself, where both Camus and Sartre, who had been with the resistance against fascism, were also against French colonialism in Algeria. But there were two differences. One was that Camus came from a settler family in Algeria. And as he said, his mother could have been in one of the cafes. And that, he said, was a problem with that she would be blown up. Because she would be, in a store buying bread, and she happened to be a settler who had been there for decades. Of course, students of literature know that Camus' L'Étranger was set in Algeria and the French colonialism. The second issue was the philosophical issue, which echoes up to today. And I must say that I wasn't quite as clear on the matter then as when I was growing up, when radicalized, as I became later. Because Sartre was saying, look, you can't stand outside history. History provides you with only two options: the violence of the oppressor or the violence of the oppressed. You can't wiggle. Are you for one side or are you for the other? This is not to do with niceties. This is the choice that history presents. And Camus said no. Now Camus went on to write about the ethics of violence in his famous book, The Rebel, in English. The Rebel, L'Homme Revolte, I think is, pardon my French pronunciation, is the original title. And Camus' point was that when rebellion, the spirit of rebellion, which is a good thing, moves from rebellion to revolution, then it loses its ethical standing and then engages in mass violence. So he was also responding to the question of Stalin here. Sartre responded to that as well, and though he did have certain criticisms of what was going on in the Soviet Union at the time, there again he said, look, history provides only these two, it's either the Americans or the Soviets. So this was not an easy debate. It's still something that all of you will have to wrestle with, though obviously we're not talking about the Soviet Union. But it's a question of, is there another way? So now we come to the meat of the matter. There are three ways you can go on the question of violence and terrorism. One is non-violence, like Mahatma Gandhi. Don't get into it. Don't touch it. Non-violent protest is the only sure way of not triggering huge violence which makes you respond with equal violence, and then you get into a downward spiral as human beings. This is one position, and it's very clearly argued. Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King. I mean, again, most of these ideas come back. They start either with France or with Russia. So we really have to go back to Tolstoy, and through Tolstoy to Jesus Christ. And this is a very clearly worked out ethic. Non-violence at all costs. Or the Buddha. Or the Buddha. So, I mean, here is the place where you have Tolstoy at one point, you have Bakunin and Kropotkin and the others. So, you know, if you study the schools of thought and the currents here, it's pretty universal. Believe me, as somebody from the outside who teaches this stuff. So the second position is, look, if you're on the right side of history, anything goes. Which is basically what the Algerian FLN guy was saying in the movie. Which is what Sartre was saying, and which is also what Fanon was saying. There was even a point of view that violence can be liberatory. That's the second point. Violence of the oppressed is justified because it is the violence of the oppressed. It's tautological. The violence of the state is unjustified because it is the violence of the state. So, the idea of justice is seen as intrinsic, or what in philosophy is called immanent. It's latent. And it's self-referential. You're a good guy because you're fighting for what you think is good. It doesn't really matter how you do it. And, you know, you'll win if you question that. So that is position 2. Then there is what I consider the most interesting position. In the literature, we hear it referred to as just war theory. That goes back to a certain theological struggle within the Christian churches, or Christian church. Because on the one hand, you have the idea of Jesus as the Prince of Peace. And on the other hand, your success, the success of the persecuted Christians who, from victims who were thrown to the lions in the Colosseum, in fairly short historical order, become the inheritors of the Roman Empire. To the point that in the last published writings of Frederick Engels, in his preface to the republication of Marx of the 18th Brumaire, he upholds as the model, now this is the 1890s, for the Marxist movement, the ultimate model is the victory of the Christians. Where he says, the Roman centurions used to turn up for parades in their tight formations with little palm crosses in their helmets. Okay, so the Christians took over the Roman Empire, and then what do you do? I mean, you have an empire, and you have to defend it. They call it the Holy Roman Empire. It's not holy, but it's still Rome. So the theological problem arose, and wrestling with that problem on the part of, in one Christian tradition, it could be St. Ambrose, Thomas Aquinas, of course, St. Augustine, for sure, before that. You have the just war tradition. Now, the just war tradition says you have criteria as to whether a war is just or not. If it doesn't meet those criteria, it is an unjust war. That's the third position. But the third position doesn't really fit this discussion as I'm rolling it out, because this is to do with movements that are fighting against the status quo. And just war theory or just war theology came from the new status quo. It's to do with the church or princely states, or what is known again in the literature as the archetype of the Christian prince. But what if you're not a Christian prince? You're neither Christian nor are you a prince. Or you are a prince, but you are what the writer once called, said of Fidel Castro, you're a guerrilla prince. Then you need something else. Because just war is how a state should or shouldn't fight wars ethically. Not all states in the world buy into that. They would say, look, I mean, if you're attacked by terrorists, we're going to do whatever we can, it doesn't matter. Or if you're attacked, and it's not even terrorists, we're going to hit back with everything we can, any way, which way we can. But there are those who, within states, among policymakers, among intellectuals, who still wrestle with this. People like Michael Walzer, Michael Ignatieff. It happened after 9/11. Within the West, there was a wrestling with the right use of violence against terrorism. But it remained limited to the use of state power. So it was a top-down view. And it doesn't affect movements which are fighting for what they regard as liberation of the nation, of the peoples, and they regard themselves as underdogs, and therefore they think that they can fight with whatever is available and whichever way they can. And that's the problem. Because unless you have a moral firewall, you inevitably start out with or you slide to terrorism. It is, as the religion would say, a temptation. Because if the state kills your family or your comrades, tortures comrades who who have been taken captive, then there is a human response to dispense with all restrictions and hit back in kind. But the world is full of examples of well-known guerrilla leaders, well-known guerrilla movements, which did not do that. Whatever the nature of the struggle. Whatever the nature of the struggle. Fidel Castro is a very good example. I won't go too deeply into that because there's a book of mine that has been published precisely on that subject, on Fidel's ethics of violence. But you would see that as a guerrilla fighting against the state, and as the leader of a state fighting against US-sponsored counter-revolutionary guerrillas in the mountains of Cuba, in the Escambray, and as the commander-in-chief of an army where volunteers went and fought all over the world, including in Angola for 12 years, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces scrupulously observed the ethics of violence. Without a single exception. And that's saying a lot. There are other such examples too. Vietnam. How did Vietnam manage to have a solidarity movement in the United States where Jane Fonda went across to Hanoi while American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam? I mean, there was a denunciation of her, but, nobody, she became a hate symbol only for those on the right. What if the Vietnamese had said, hey, you guys are sympathetic to our cause, can you please, these guys are bombing us, they're bombing us more than they bombed Nazi Germany, can you please put this bomb in the subway? Teach them what it's like. The Vietnamese never did that. They never did that. There were more bombs dropped on Vietnam than during the whole of World War II. But never once did they do that. Then you have, I'm giving you examples which are diverse. Latin America, Asia, I'll give you one from Africa. So that will complete the set, because you will see that it's not just one isolated exception. In Africa, you had, I'm sure some of the militants studied here, where it was Lumumba University, the liberation movements fighting against Portuguese colonialism in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. There were settlers, we are coming back to the question of Algeria, and also the question today of Israel-Palestine, and even in some internal wars, such as Sri Lanka. The question of settlements in areas that are seen as the traditional homeland of another nation or ethnic group. There were Portuguese settlers. Portugal was not as powerful a society as France, and the distance was greater, so you didn't have as many settlers as you did, but there they were. And there were debates among the African liberation movements. But in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, the national liberation movements were so scrupulous in their targeting that finally the Portuguese army that was fighting them was radicalized by the struggles and the propaganda of the enemy they were fighting against, and there was a revolution in Portugal spearheaded by the army in 1974. So, I've now given you three major examples. The non-resort to terrorism, the avoidance of terrorism, the banning of terrorism, terrorism as a taboo in the struggle for liberation, not only makes you a good guy or a good girl, it also makes you smarter, because you are able to have some resonance, some soft power, as Professor Joseph Nye has chosen to call it. But you are able to have ethical and political hegemony as Antonio Gramsci called it a long time before Joseph Nye, in the society of your enemy. Because you are fighting on the basis of universal human values. You're fighting asymmetric war at its best. Because those who resort to terrorism fall into the trap of fighting a symmetrical war. You're bombing us, we are using suicide bombers to hit your civilians. So you lose your dialectical ability, to use a philosophical term which used to be quite common here. You are unable to use your weakness as a strength. You're unable to match the enormous superiority that the status quo has with the moral superiority that derives not only from the justice of your cause, which may be evident only to you, but also the manifest justice of your methods. So when Mao's People's Liberation Army handed back captives, when Fidel handed back captives, they were actually doing propaganda for themselves, because those people went back and said, hey, those guys are not what we thought they were. You know, this is the way they treated us. But when ISIL kills its captives, then it tells the whole world that these guys are monsters, morally. I mean, it may make their constituents feel great, but that just tells you about their constituents. Now, I'm going to conclude. I didn't say I'll tell you about my book, but I'll make that a postscript. I'm going to conclude by looking at it from the other side, the side of the state. Believe you me, I've done that myself. I've had to. I told you I've been on both sides of this. There's an old Joni Mitchell song, which is called Both Sides Now. I've been on both sides of this. Now, from the point of view of the state, I think there are policy implications. Not every state observes these policy implications. But I would say, as somebody who's been through the 30-year war, or more than one civil war in the course of 30 years, that terrorism is a pathology. It doesn't mean that everybody's nuts, but what I mean is you have to understand it as you would understand a biomedical phenomenon. You must, the right diagnosis is the sine qua non, the precondition of the right prognosis and the right prescription. This is so in policy as well. If you treat every armed movement as a terrorist movement, then you're not going to succeed. Because even if you win, you lose. Just as movements that are fighting against the system, if they use terrorism, even if they seem to win, they eventually lose. But if they don't, and they fight using just methods, then even if they lose militarily, they eventually win politically. I mean, Latin America is full of ex-revolutionaries who have miserably failed as guerrillas, but who have been elected presidents. Because of the moral victory. The moral victory. There are presidents, there are vice presidents, who have won elections, having spent years having lost insurrections. The same goes for the state. If you fight in the wrong way, you may win militarily, but you will lose morally, ethically, diplomatically, politically, and there will be an echo down the line. And what is the right way and what is the wrong way? In order to know what the right way is and what the wrong way is, you must know who you're fighting. What kind of movement are you fighting? Now, this is not me preaching a Tolstoyan doctrine for the state. I mean, it could be a perfectly clean, beautifully behaved, armed revolutionary movement, but if they're coming at you with guns, you're going to have to defend yourself with guns if you are a state. Now, that's the kind of fight I would rather not get in the middle of. But if you're a state, You have to defend your citizens, you have to defend yourself. But you do it, I hope, in a different way. Because if it is not a terrorist movement, you can negotiate. I'm not saying that should be your only option or even your first option, but it is possible. It's like, as I said, a pathogen. If it's of a certain sort, if it's not malignant, you can treat it in a certain way. You can't not do anything about it, but there's a certain regime of treatment that is possible. But if it is a terrorist movement, then that's a different ballgame. And if you don't respond to it with the force that you must, then you will have a situation that existed here before clarity and purpose and will dawned and the bombs stopped going off in theaters and in schools in Russia. And suicide bombers stopped hitting civilian targets. So, if you ask me, what are the examples of successful struggles against terrorist movements, I would definitely say the Russian state versus the Chechen terrorists, Sri Lanka versus the Tamil Tigers, and Angola versus UNITA. Those have been the successful models, and most recently, I think, Syria. But as students, here is where I suggest you do your research. And with this, I'm reaching the end of my presentation, and then we'll open up for questions. Think of a typology which would help you understand that not all resistance movements are terrorist, and not all terrorist movements, even though they claim to fight for justice, are legitimate liberation or resistance movements. And I would suggest, and this has been the fruit of my research as well as my experience, that if a movement makes a practice of the witting targeting of non-combatant, i.e. innocent civilians, then that movement, however just the cause it stands for, is resorting to terrorism. And if it does so continuously, then you're not just talking about the resort to terrorism as a method, you're talking about a movement that can be classified as a terrorist movement. There's a line there. There are some movements which have sporadically resorted to terrorism, but are perhaps not classifiable as terrorist movements, such as the IRA of Northern Ireland. But there are some movements which have resorted to terrorism so often that quantity becomes quality, again in the old dialectical sense, and their moral character, their political behavior enables them to be classified as terrorist movements. And there are movements which have not resorted to terrorism, but which still resort to arms. As I said, the state has to respond, but not perhaps in the same way. So, these classifications are something that students should give. And also anybody who wants to change the world, not just students. If you want to change the world, you have to know how to do it, what the right way is, because obviously you want to change it for the better, not for the worse. And if you want to, I almost said rule the world, you have to know the right way to do it, as distinct from the wrong way. And you must know right from wrong. And I would say that near universally, you would be able to get acceptance for the idea that the intentional, i.e. the witting, targeting of unarmed, non-combatant civilians, that's not armed settlers, that's something else, is the firewall. That's what differentiates a terrorist from somebody who is a rebel or a revolutionary or resistance fighter. And the nature of the cause, the self-evident justice of the cause, isn't a free pass that enables you to resort to terrorism and not be classified as such. I think that states such as Russia, Sri Lanka, China, we should all work together with movements that have fought for their rights with arms in hand in many parts of the world, and evolve a code of ethics that everyone would sign up to, which says, which renounces the deliberate targeting of civilians under any circumstances, whether they are movements or states. This is a moral and ethical compact that we can arrive at. And that is the suggestion I would make. That's something I hope that you would fight for, and I hope that you will research the suggestions that I threw out of the possibility of analyzing the behavior of armed movements over time and evolving a classification, a typology of these movements where you can differentiate between terrorist and non-terrorist movements. I conclude by this selfish pitch for my own work on the subject. I would suggest two books. One is a full-fledged work on Fidel Castro's ethics of violence, which has been reviewed in Radical Philosophy, also the Chatham House Journal, from right to left. It's called Fidel's Ethics of Violence. It's the subtitle is the moral philosophy of Fidel Castro. It was published by Pluto in London, and it's sold in the United States by the University of Chicago Press. So you just have to Google that. It's on Amazon. You can get that. And the other is it's not strictly about this subject, but I might as well make a pitch for it anyway. But it does talk about terrorism as well. It's called The Fall of Global Socialism, a Counter-Narrative from the South. That was published by Paul Gray Macmillan in London. So those are the two books in which I've worked this out in wearing my academic hat rather than my diplomatic hat. And I would suggest that if you're interested, you follow it up by reading those two books. Thank you very much. I don't really know how much time I've taken, but I'll be willing to answer any and all questions you pose me, directly flowing from or indirectly related to